In the late fall of 2010, my dad, mom, sister, uncle, and I decided to try and hike to the Goat Canyon Trestle located deep in the desert of San Diego County in Southern California near the Mexico border. The trestle is basically a very tall bridge-like structure made entirely of wooden beams and columns that was built with the railroad in the early 1900s. The railroad is now decommissioned and the tracks, bridges, and tunnels are all abandoned. There is a lot of good and interesting information about the trestle online if you are interested. It is allegedly one of the tallest freestanding wooden structures in the world. I believe now there's a lot more information on how to hike out to the trestle online, but back in 2010 there was very limited information about it, and you really had to search deep to get information on where to start and the route to take. My uncle was super into these remote abandoned locations at the time, and it was his hobby to research and plan out how to get to them. There was no dedicated trail at the time to the trestle. I'm not sure if there is even one today, and you had to do more or less make your own path across the rocky desert hills. I was a sophomore in college at the time, and we were all decided it would be best to do the hiking over Thanksgiving weekend when me and my sister would be in town for the holidays, and it would be cool enough temperatures to attempt. When we got to the location where we parked our car, it was pretty barren and out in the middle of nowhere with desert all around. My uncle told us we would have to hike up into the hills ahead of us and then down the other side through a canyon that led to the trestle. It's this canyon that the trestle traverses. The hike started off without incident, but the lack of a dedicated trail soon made it difficult. The terrain was very rocky with loose slate rocks that were lined with sand and made you slip and fall easily. Within the first few hours, I had fallen and scraped my knees and hands several times. It was a lot of scrambling over rock to get up into the hills, and it took us much longer and a lot more effort than we expected. We probably started the hike around 9 or 10 a.m., but by the time we reached the top of the hills, it was already mid-afternoon, and we still had to traverse down the canyon on the other side of the trestle, and then walk all the way back to the car. Recall that it was around Thanksgiving time and the sun would set around 5 p.m. My mom and dad were naturally worried that we didn't have enough daylight to make it back to the trestle and back, and thought that we should start heading back to my car. But my uncle really wanted to at least see the trestle from the top of the canyon and said he would go on ahead alone while we went back. Being the young, invincible-minded male I was at the time, I convinced my parents to let me go with my uncle. My uncle and I were much faster hikers than my parents and sister, and we were sure we could make it through the trestle and back with enough light. We parted ways, and my uncle and I continued into the hills towards the canyon. And this is where things started getting very strange. I want to take a moment to explain a little about the area for those who might not be familiar. As I said above, the trestle is located relatively close to the Mexico border, along with the abandoned tracks, running between Yuma, Arizona and San Diego, California, more or less paralleling the Mexican border. This area at the time was well known to be a very active route for illegal immigrants crossing into the United States from Mexico. There were stories online that my uncle found that said people would hide in their abandoned train tunnels to escape the border patrol officers during the day and would then walk the abandoned tracks at night. Border Patrol was also very active in the area at the time. It was also a hot spot for coyotes and mules, not the animals, but individuals who help escort immigrants into the country and individuals who are transporting illegal drugs. Getting back to the story, my uncle and I continued through the hills in search of the canyon that led down to the trestle. After we had been walking for a while, we came across a small grove of fan palms. If you're not familiar with fan palms, they are basically a shorter and stockier version of a typical palm tree with a lot of palm fronds arranged down the trunk of the tree, such that the actual trunk can't be seen behind all the fronds. The palms in this grove are all relatively short, ranging maybe from 8 to 10 feet tall, and the fronds dropped all the way to the base of the tree. I remember it was a little creepy coming across the grove in the middle of the hills. It felt like something was beyond the thick layer of palm fronds watching us, and I would be lying if I wasn't a bit relieved when we continued past them. Eventually, my uncle and I found the canyon that we thought led down from the hills of the trestle. The canyon was very rugged with tons of loose rock. You can only imagine how difficult it was trying to go down it, slipping and sliding over the rocks the whole way. Once we were about halfway down, the sun was just starting to set, and that eerie quietness that comes with sunsets in the desert washed over the canyon. It was also starting to get cold, with the sun dipping below the hills, covering the canyon in shadows. It was around this time that both my uncle and I started seeing things. We both swear we saw my mom at the top of the canyon, looking down at us. My uncle joked with me that my mom would never let me go on alone and she must have followed us. We continued down the canyon some more, and when we looked back up, there was no one there. We thought maybe she had just walked behind some rocks or something and began calling out to her from below. There was no response. I admit I was a little freaked out then and told my uncle we should start heading back, but my uncle wanted to keep going and insisted that we must be close. He was right. Around the next few bends, we saw the trestle ahead of us. It was very cool to see, but we still had a good way down the canyon to actually get to the base of it, let alone climb to the top of it, which was our original plan. My uncle, being the crazy adventurous guy he is, insisted we keep going, but as we were heading down further, I stumbled and sprained my ankle very badly, and I decided that I couldn't go any further down. My uncle finally agreed and said he would just go alone a little way further to get some pictures, and then we would turn around and head back together. So there I was, sitting alone in this canyon that was getting darker and darker by the minute, trying to mend my twisted ankle when I looked back up the canyon to see if my mom was visible again. I didn't see anything initially, but something large moved out of the corner of my eye up the canyon sun, like it was darting between a rock. This freaked me out, and I felt a sense of dread wash over me, like I was being watched from every shadow. I remember it was so quiet, it felt unnatural. A little while longer, my uncle returned, and we began to make our way back up the canyon. It was very dark at this point, and just a glimmer of sunset was left on the horizon. I was really starting to freak out because I knew we would be walking back in pitch black. When we were almost at the top of the canyon, my uncle, who was walking ahead of me, stopped in his tracks and pointed ahead. It was my mom again, standing at the top of the canyon looking down at us. We both yelled at her, but she didn't respond or even move. She just stared at us. We continued forward, thinking maybe she couldn't hear us, and when we came around the next bend, she was gone again. I was losing it at this point, and I'm not sure what I would have done if my uncle hadn't been there with me. We eventually made it back to the top of the canyon. It was indeed pitch black. There was no sign of my mom or anyone else. We were utterly alone in the dark desert hills. Luckily, my uncle had a small headlamp that he brought with him, and we used that to start our slow trek back through the hills to the car, and hopefully to my waiting family. I can't explain to you how dark it felt out there. It felt like I couldn't see my hand from my face. The only thing keeping us on a somewhat path was this small beam of light from my uncle's headlamp. We had no camping or emergency gear. Stupid, I know, but we were able to find the small path we had come by on the way into the canyon and began following it back. After some time, we made it back to the grove of fan palms. I would be lying if I told you I wasn't terrified seeing those trees in the dark, just standing watch over the path like ancient centennials. I remembered how I felt the first time we encountered the palms and how it felt like something was watching us through the fronds. I hesitantly followed my uncle through the trees. As we walked by, there was a loud rustle from one of the trees, much too loud to be just a rodent or a reptile. My uncle swung the headlamp around on the trees, but there was nothing there. A few seconds later, there was more rustling from the tree behind us. Again, my uncle shined the headlamp at the tree, but it was completely still. It was at this moment that I felt something push me hard away from the palm I was standing in front of, and I crashed down into the dirt. I remember it felt like something had reached through the fronds and pushed me from behind, but I don't remember hearing any rustling, even though I was so close to the tree. I was utterly freaked now and started yelling at my uncle that something had pushed me from inside the tree. My uncle went up to the tree with the headlamp and peered deep inside to see if he could see anything, but there was nothing. After that, we quickly made our way out of the grove and continued through the hills back towards the car. I remember it felt like forever walking through those hills in the complete darkness, and every once in a while, I would hear rustling behind or to the side of us, but there was no way to know what it was with no light. The whole way I felt like something was following us through, trailing just behind us, outside the light where we couldn't see it, but I could feel its presence. Finally, we made it through the hills and were about to traverse back down to the car. In the distance, we see a faint light coming towards us. As we get closer, it was apparent that the light was coming from someone with a flashlight, and me and my uncle were nervous whether this individual was there to help or harm us. Given the position we were in, however, we decided to make our way to the light, and thankfully, it was a Border Patrol agent who was actually out looking for us. The agent had come across my family who were waiting for me and my uncle in our car, and my parents told them that we were still out there. The agent then went looking for us. The agent led my uncle and I back to our car, where my terrified mom rushed to hug me and scold my uncle. We then told my mom that we had seen her at the top of the canyon and asked her why she didn't respond to us or wait for us to get to her. I will never forget that sinking feeling I felt in my stomach when my mom told us she had never gone any further after her, my dad, and my sister turned back and left me and my uncle to go on alone. She said they had been waiting in the car for hours for us to return. I don't know who or what me and my uncle saw in that canyon, or what was inside those fan palms, but I know for certain we were not alone out there that night. Maybe it was all just our minds playing tricks on us, but it's been 14 years now, and I still think about it to this very day. The reason I always keep all the doors locked. Back with another one, as I will likely post as I remember them. I've done so much healing this year that buried memories keep resurfacing, like this little gem. This was some years ago when I was living in a different city. I hadn't really been on my own all that long, and my housing situation fell apart at the last minute, so I had to scramble to figure it out, meaning, you guessed it, random roommates. Now, the year before, I had a random roommate that was the most amazing person and ended up becoming a great friend, so I figured this would be the same. It was not. But that's actually not the focus of the story. Enter the roommates. Ben, who I did actually know a bit from the previous year and was becoming friends with. Tom and Mike. Now, this was the very first couple days after move-in, and we'd all hung out to get to know each other a bit better. But Tom and Mike hadn't fully moved in yet. It was a big old house separated by a floor and the top level locked at the stairs. This is important to note. Ben and I lived upstairs with Tom and Mike downstairs. I've always been paranoid and definitely have good reason to. So when I'm home, all doors are locked. When I leave, all doors are locked. I sleep with my bedroom locked. I was home alone with Ben at work and Tom and Mike sort of in and out of moving stuff in. I'll note here that both had a lot of expensive stuff, like in the 5-figure range. Well, I was watching something on my laptop in my room. Bedroom locked and both entrances to my part of the house locked. I started hearing a lot of noise coming from downstairs, sounding like doors and cupboards opening, furniture moving, etc. And I figured it's just Tom or Mike until I hear footsteps coming up the stairs. I was technically supposed to be somewhere at the time, which they knew, but it had been canceled last minute, so no one would have known I was home. And they had no reason to come upstairs when they knew both of us were supposed to be gone. That was when I got panicky, hearing them come closer and closer to the top of the stairs. I've never sat so still. Then the knob began to jiggle. I could hear it clearly as my room was closest to the entryway. At this point, I'm on with 911 whispering that someone is in my house without giving away that I'm there to whoever it was. The house was super close to downtown and cops arrived in mere minutes, but they were the longest of my life at that moment. The downstairs were completely ransacked, like something out of a movie. It was so surreal to see. They'd taken over $20,000 in electronics. Honestly, I don't remember the exact amount, just about that, I think. Broken furniture and plates and stuff, even ripped through the mattresses. Turned out Tom and Mike had left the door unlocked when moving. This would be the last time before I fled this house. They were gone before the cops showed, so I'd spent the next several months afraid they'd come back. Though it would turn out to be the least of my future worries, so glad that I always locked doors. Considering the way downstairs looked, I don't know what they would have done to me. To whoever was on the other side of that thankfully locked door, let's not meet. I'm not gonna hurt you. Remembering these words still sends a chill up my spine. This was a few years ago. My 33M husband and 43M and I were getting gas late one night. This was a bit of a weird gas station where two roads intersected at an angle, with the gas station being on the acute angle, if you can picture that. At the pump we chose, there was no working lights and it was difficult to see directly from either road. We were driving a soft-top Jeep Wrangler with all of the rear windows taken off. My husband got out to pump and I was sitting in the passenger seat looking at my phone. That's when I heard it. "I'm not going to hurt you," a wavery voice said some distance behind me. I froze, suddenly terrified. I turned around to look at the empty space where our back window used to be, and saw what appeared to be a homeless man a little ways off. He had slightly wild gray hair, a washed out beanie, and an oversized jacket with lots of pockets that hid his hands. I suddenly realized how dark it was and how hard it was for anyone to see us, and I couldn't see his hands. I had a distinct feeling from deep down, so prominent I could almost hear it. Run. But we're just pumping gas. He's just a weird homeless dude. My husband and I were from Key West. We had seen plenty of them before, and they were almost all harmless, so I slowly turned back around and went back to my phone, yet I still heard him. The distinct sound of shuffling feet, the rustle of his jacket. "I'm not gonna hurt you," he said again. "I just need some help. Do you have any money? I'm not going to hurt you." At this point, I could tell he was almost at the Jeep. We had only been there for a couple of minutes, and we'd been on almost empty. There was no way the tank was full. Without warning, my husband rushed into the car and hurried to start the engine. I could tell his hands were shaking. He managed to throw the car into drive, and we peeled out of there. I looked behind us and saw the man standing there, not reacting. Next to the dangling nozzle, my husband hadn't bothered hanging back up. As we turned out of the gas station, my husband said, "I just had the most horrible feeling. Something in me just told me to run." I looked at him in horror and told him I'd felt the same thing. I felt tears come to my eyes as I thanked him for listening to his instincts. We went home feeling quite shaken, just going over the events we had just seen and felt the way we felt. It was a day or two later that we watched a YouTube video by security analyst Scott Stewart on the Kenyon Mall shooting, and he said that in every event like this there are people who said, "Right before it happened, I had a terrible feeling that something bad was about to happen." He adds that some people listen to that feeling and leave the area, while others mention how much they regret not listening to it. I burst into tears hearing this, knowing the feeling he had described all too well. I had had that feeling, and was one of those who ignored it. I remember crying, "Thank you," at my husband for listening to his sense of danger. Now, it is fully possible that it was just a harmless person asking for money in a slightly creepy way, and that nothing bad would have happened, but I can't stop remembering how the weird angles kept anyone from seeing us. I can't stop thinking about how dark it was, and I can't stop thinking about how his hidden hands. And I still get full body chills remembering him say, "I'm not going to hurt you." Moral of the story, I guess, if you ever get that distinct feeling that something bad is imminent, leave the area. It may be a false alarm, and it happens a lot. You may want a hyperactive anxiety response and might want to try Lexapro, but it's better than going through the rest of your life wishing you had listened to that feeling. The Haulers. Growing up in rural Alaska, I experienced a lot of weird things, amazing herds of caribou, etc. But the weirdest things to me are the times I wasn't able to see the source of yelling or hollering. A lot of times I traveled alone through the Brooks Range and up onto the North Slope to hunt and trap. From a young age, I learned how to hunt and field dress animals, set up survival shelters, and even how to travel at night with the usage of the constellations like my ancestors before me. These long and very arduous journeys sometimes brought me more than I was willing to endure. In the winter of 2017, I had a trap line along the left side of the valley, headed northbound. A trap was set every few miles, and I was traveling along my trail when I saw a figure and a bunch of diamond willows ahead of me. The bunch of brush was about a mile or so away, but I could see the dark figure walking like a person. I wondered who would be out in January when it's the coldest time of the year just walking. When they suddenly vanished, I took out my binoculars and scanned the area and just put it off as my imagination or someone with a snow machine, snowmobile for you lower 48ers. And they had taken off along my trail, so I continued on. At the next trap, I stopped and shut off my machine. It was calm and surprisingly warm, like negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit, for that time of the year, so I was able to shed my parka to reset the spring trap that I had come across. As I set the trap, I started to hear a low, bellowing noise from up in a small valley. It came off like a person just yelling, "Ah!" at first, but then it grew deeper, like a bear warning off another. But it was January, nothing like that would be out and about. The most you'd ever find would be wolves, wolverines, and caribou. Even moose tend to travel south for that time of year. As I started to pack up, the noise began again. It grew louder and louder. I remembered the figure I saw and wondered if they had anything to do with it. But I did my best to ignore the noise like my elders had taught me and go about my business. Then I could feel eyes on me. I looked towards the valley where I felt the weird sensation and there was nothing. I even pulled out my binos and looked. Nothing. I listened for the noise again, and when the bellowing began again, I responded. I did the same noise back at it and it stopped quickly, like it recognized this noise I made. Then it all went silent. I was uneasy, so I packed up and left as quickly as possible. I haven't been back there since. I pulled the trap line that winter. I don't plan on going back.